Hello and welcome to T-SQL for Beginners. This is a course that will cover some introductory topics in T-SQL. And what I've done is I have put together a course syllabus. So, that sounds really fancy. This is basically an outline of what the course is going to cover each session. Now, really cool thing that I did with this. I'm so excited. Let's see if I can get my Zoom working properly. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. This is actually put together using GitHub pages. So on this syllabus here, this is litkind.github.io/tsql beginners. It says view on GitHub. And all this is formatting a README doc that I've got in a public GitHub repo. Pretty cool. So thanks to Buckwitty for showing me how to do that. But the syllabus is going to go ahead and get us started. There's all sorts of stuff in here for how to get going. So it tells you that what we'll be doing is we'll be doing this course live, and recordings will be stored in a Redgate Community Circle video. So if you're joining this course later and you want to catch up on things, you can come here, watch all of the videos. It will have links to things. It also has handy dandy calendar reminders if you are attending live and you want to see this each week. We also have a course Slack discussion. If you want to chat about T-SQL, about the homework, work on with others through the class, there's a SQL Server community Slack group, which is really, really good. You actually should join this for all sorts of reasons. But for this class, there is a channel called T-SQL Beginners. It's totally free to sign up for this Slack and join this. You can ask questions about the homework, make snarky comments about T-SQL, whatever you'd like. To follow along with the course, you're going to need a couple of tools to already be installed. There are free versions of them all. You want a SQL Server instance. So if you're running Windows, you can do Developer Edition from Microsoft, and I've got a link to the free downloads. They've got this really great download page now. I was looking at this today. And they've got all sorts of interesting information on here. If you are running Windows on your laptop, or you have a VM running Windows that you want to use for this course, you probably want to go here to Developer Edition, download from here, and install it. As long as you are not using this for production purposes, you can use Developer Edition to learn for free. But what if you're using a Mac? If you're using a Mac, and I'm not using a Mac today, but I used to use a Mac for SQL Server. If you're using a Mac, you might want to, unless you want to run a VM on your Mac and that VM is running Windows, you could do that. But VM software usually costs money. If you want a free version, you could run a Docker container containing SQL Server 19 totally for free. You would scroll down here, click on this link. And I would say that your best choice, if you're running on a Mac, pull and run SQL Server on a Linux container on Docker. This all sounds real fancy, but it actually doesn't take that long to do. It is not that hard to do if you haven't done this stuff before. So this will walk you through the article on how to do it. So that is how to set up. We're not going to do demos of how to set it up, but if you're having problems with that and you've got questions, you could hit us up in the Slack channel, and we'll do our best to help you through this. So that's the thing you're going to run the queries against, is the SQL Server. We're going to run queries against the SQL Server. We're going to have databases on the SQL Server and access data in it. But in order to run the queries against the SQL Server, we need a client. And the client is, you want to use either Azure Data Studio or SQL Server Management Studio. Both of these are free on Microsoft if you are running Windows. Both of these run on Windows. If you're using a Mac, well, Azure Data Studio runs on a Mac. Hey, we've got an option that natively runs on a Mac now. I will be doing most of the demos for this in Azure Data Studio. I don't promise that I'm an expert in Azure Data Studio. I think it'll be fun, and I like to learn stuff, so I'll be doing it in there. It is very helpful. I won't be requiring a bunch of extensions. You can add these extensions to Azure Data Studio, most of which are free, but I just don't want to add a lot of complexity, so I won't be using a ton of extensions. I want to keep it simple. There is one extension called the SSMS Keymap extension that I do have installed. It does make things a lot easier because the shortcuts you use in there, it just makes it a lot easier to use. Very simple shortcuts in there too. So I have a link on how to install that. Here is what we're going to cover each week, and today we are about to dive into this, I promise. Today we are going to introduce select statements and aliasing and get started here. We'll talk about how to connect with the different tools. So there are two files that we will be using today. So here I have a link to them. The first file that you're going to watch me step through today, if you want to follow along with the video, this is file number 1, select an alias _demo.sql. So all you got to do here is you can click on this, or you can right click and say open a new tab. This shows the file in GitHub. Right, so here we've got this script, which is 436 lines. If you click on the raw button here, you get to a page where this is just only the script itself. So you can, select everything, and then you can paste it into the editor of your choice. Now, if you're fancier and you already know how to use GitHub, you can clone the repo and all that stuff. But if you're not a big GitHub user, just go to the script, click on the raw button, ain't no shame in copy paste. So let's go ahead and copy this script. I'll just show you how this works. I here have SQL Server Management Studio open. And we'll just do a little bit of, if you are using Management Studio, I'll show you how to get started in there. Then I'm going to switch over to Azure Data Studio. The first thing in this script, if you have done a little SQL, you might be like, why does she have a raise error as the very first thing in her script? Well, I like to use the keyboard for a lot of things. And one of the things that I commonly do, maybe, more commonly than I'd like to admit, is I've been known to accidentally run the entire script. With these IDEs, you're supposed to highlight something and then run it. So I could highlight this query. This query says verify you're connected to a dedicated test instance. And then I could hit the execute button. And that's fine, right? I highlighted one thing, I hit execute, it ran one thing. By the way, my instance name is in fact derp, or my server name is in fact derp. That is where I'm connected to. But one thing that I've been known to do sometimes is just accidentally not highlight something and either hit a shortcut. You can use the shortcut F5 to execute. I like to do Control E because I'm an old person, and that's kind of an older thing that people used to use. But I'll accidentally run the entire script. So out of habit, the reason that these have this raise error statement at the top is that since I'm trying to use my zoom here and it's not zooming to the part of the window I expect. So we're just gonna make our message text a little bit bigger there because I have unexpected zooming problems today. What this raise error thing is, it's using an error severity level of 20, and it says with log. This is a really high severity level, and this level of severity terminates. It says, okay, this is such a high severity error, I'm going to actually disconnect you. Notice that it now says disconnected down here at the bottom of the terminal, and I'm not going to run anything else in this batch. Now, with log does mean this is going to write to the SQL Server error log. This is not a script to be testing against a production SQL Server instance. I'm assuming you're only using these scripts on a private SQL Server that's just for learning. Hence the developer edition, right? So that's what this raise error thing does is it means that if I accidentally execute the whole script, it's not going to fill the screen with gibberish or, put something in a weird state for me. I have this kind of safety doorstop at the beginning of the script in case I forget to highlight something. So this is some of my favorite wording. I cannot continue the execution because the session is in the kill state. I didn't make that up. That's all the Microsoft wording. But this is also one of my old-time favorites to see. Severe error occurred. The results, if any, should be discarded. Let's discard those errors. So I'm using the keyboard shortcut Control-R to hide the results pane in Management Studio. You don't have to do that. That's just so I can show you more about what's on the screen. So if you are doing this in Management Studio, we just pasted this stuff into Management Studio. And for this first introductory session, we will be using a sample database from Microsoft. This sample database is very useful. If you already have a copy of this around, you can use whatever copy you have around. So if you already have a copy of Wide World Importers Restored, just use it. You don't need to do anything. Even if you've modified it, it's no big deal. If you don't have a copy of this yet, this will be useful for other things too, because this is a widely used sample database with tables with data in it. So I think it's a good one to have around. You want to just go to this location in a browser and download the file. There's multiple things. You want to download the one named Wide World Importers-full.back and move it into a directory where your SQL Server instance can read from it. So on my SQL Server instance, the way I like to do things here is I like to create a folder named MS SQL. I only have a C drive. This is not a production server. This isn't even a development server. This is a learning server. I like to create a directory C MS SQL BAK. You can put this wherever you want, but this is just where I put backup files that I am going to restore. And once again, we're going to have to just give up on Zoom It. I did best effort, but it just really, it seems to be zooming on my other screen for some reason. I don't know what's up with my Zoom It tool. We'll work on improving that next time. So I've put Wide World Importers -full.back in that folder, and then you want to restore the database. Now, the first thing I do is make sure, am I collected to the right place? So I'm going to go ahead and actually let me change around my menus up here. So on toolbars here, I'm just going to now make sure I've got this execute here. I'm just trying to put this as front of you as I can. I am selecting the server name I'm connected to. Okay, yeah, I'm not connected to anything I don't know. And now I'm going to restore the database. What you can do with this script is just edit it depending on where you have things stored and what folders you have set up on your machine. So we already saw that I have C MS SQL back, right? This is where that backup thing is. So I'm saying we want to restore this database from this location. And this database has multiple files. So I'm saying if the database already exists, I want to replace the database that exists. And then I'm going to handle all these different files because I have to tell it where to actually restore different physical files in the database to. So you may need to change this directory to a directory that you have, right? So I'm saying move this file to this location, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So going to run this script. This script says here, what it's saying is we are going to use the master database. And then if the database exists, if the database named Wide World Importers exists, we are going to set it as offline immediately. Any queries running in the Wide World Importers database will be canceled, and we are going to set it offline. The reason that that's there is that restoring over an existing database that is active in it, or it has activity in it, can be tricky, and you may have to fight with locks there. So this just says, this is, I call the, this is the serious option of like, okay, if it's there, put it offline. We do have to be in a different database to put that offline. Put that database offline and then restore over it. So now I can restore over my database there. Wide World Importers is not huge. It should restore fairly quickly on your instance. I'm actually surprised that it took 13 seconds. That's actually a fairly long restore on there. It brings the database online, and I'm running, a later version of SQL Server than this database was created in, so it automatically brings it up to the version of SQL Server that I'm running on. And it says, there was a certain amount of latency that was happening here because that did take 13 seconds. But that's fine. So ask yourself, why do we set it offline? We set it offline because if someone's using it, which is probably, like if someone's using it, this should be a test instance that only you are using. So someone who is using it is usually like me in another session window I have open over here, right? Like usually what happens is that I forget that I have Wide World Importers open, over here. I have like 6 tabs open. I have something over here using Wide World Importers. I'm trying to restore it in this session, and it's actually me in that other session who it's like, oh, somebody's using that, right? So this just says, get rid of other Kendra. Hopefully none of your production databases are actually named Wide World Importers, right? Hopefully. We'll see. Got a comment from the chat. Great server name. I don't think the server group here would go with that name. And, that's why it's a really good name for a test instance, is that it's unlikely to conflict with anything it use in your organization. I think the derp, I also have a derp domain. I believe in the derp world. So that's how to get going in Azure Data Studio. We are in SQL Server Management Studio. If I click About here, this is SQL Server Management Studio. I'm running 18.5. And you can run the rest of this file in SQL Server Management Studio. SQL Server Management Studio is an old friend of mine. It is a great tool, but I want to encourage, if you have been using SQL Server for a little while and you're comfortable with this, I would encourage you to try out Azure Data Studio. So I just did help about, I then nudged my coffee. I am running Azure Data Studio here. It is not necessarily a replacement for SQL Server Management Studio for everyone. Azure Data Studio has slightly different stuff in it than SQL Server Management Studio, and I think it's really nice for doing things like running T-SQL and for writing queries and working with queries. If you are a database administrator, it's not going to have every feature and every wizard in here that Management Studio has. You're still going to use Management Studio for a lot of things. But I actually think when it comes to working with source control, when it comes to writing T-SQL, or using these things called Jupyter Notebooks, we may bring a few of those in later in the class, but we're not going to look at them today. It's really, really cool. So it has some functionality that is a little different. And I think it complements Management Studio well. So you can choose to use either of these tools, either Management Studio or Azure Data Studio. Now in Azure Data Studio, I actually have this connected to the source control for this. And here's the Files tab. You could do the same thing I showed earlier where you just do a new window and paste in the code and connect to your SQL Server instance. That would be fine as well. All right, so you'll see here I am. I am connected to my SQL Server instance and I can run the query. So I just ran that raise error again. Notice that it does the exact same thing. This isn't any different. All right, so the database restore would also work the same in here as well. We also have this concept of using databases. So notice here that this says master in this window here. Which database context am I in? When I click on the drop down here, you can see that, there's a whole lot of different SQL Server databases on this instance. And if I ever, in Azure Data Studio, I clicked change connection there, I am running against my default instance of SQL Server, which I have just connected to with the dot there. And just like before, if I want to know exactly where I'm connected to, yes, I am still connected to derp. I can always run a query to see, hey, what am I connected to if I'm not sure? I also should be able to, let's see, and this is me kind of learning Azure Data Studio. I'm like, does it not tell me down here? It tells me, yeah, it just tells me since I connected with the dot here, it just tells me I'm connected to dot master. It's probably a better... See, there I just typed in derp. It's a better practice to actually, instead of saying dot connect to any default instance you can find, I should tell it what connection to actually do so that in the bottom right, it can verify for me what connection, what server/instance are you connected to, what database context are you in. I restored Wide World Importer, so I want to run queries against it. And the easiest way to do that is to run a use statement. I want to use the database with this name. Then I use go. I can also, if I don't want to run T-SQL, I can do Control U in Management Studio. So let's see if this works in Azure Data Studio. I don't think Control U works in it, even with the extensions. And I have the SSMS key map extension installed. Not all of the same shortcuts work in Azure Data Studio. So one of the most popular shortcuts I use in SSMS is Control U, but when I hit that in Azure Data Studio, yeah, it doesn't do it. in Azure Data Studio, I'll either need to figure out what the shortcut is or figure out how to map it myself, use this dropdown, or alternately run the T-SQL and execute it. So it's always good to make sure you know that you are in the right database context. Now you can query across databases. We're about to run our first query. This is super exciting. Well, we've been running queries. In fact, our restore statement and these if statements, these are all queries. We ran commands against the database, but we're going to run the first one that actually is like a select statement that interacts with data. And notice that the select statement I'm running, it doesn't have a database name anywhere in it. It doesn't say Wide World Importers. If I don't specify a database name, it will just say, oh, what database have you used? What database context are you in? And it will look for that object in there. So let's go ahead and run this query. So my run button is over here in Azure Data Studio. I keep trying to look for it over there, but it's over at the left. And now I get a data set back. So what I've said here is I want to select, and let me just make this font a little bigger. In Azure Data Studio, one of the nice things, you can do Control+ to zoom in and out dynamically. So if you want things to be bigger, you can just Control+. Really, really nice how it magnifies things for you very easily. So what the star means is all columns. We want to return all columns in sys.tables. Sys.tables is a built-in view. This exists in every database. It's provided by Microsoft, and it'll just list out what are all of the tables in the database. So I can see that we have a table named colors. It has an object ID, right? These are just all the columns for it. These are user tables. I can see different metadata about them and browse through it. Lots of property, lots of columns about these tables, right? Like is Edge. New stuff on there. This is a really, really simple query. And what we're doing, there's actually a fair amount of complexity built into this simple statement. Because what we're saying is we want to select or return all of the columns from, this is a schema name, and this is a table name. Tables can be organized into different schemas. And schemas are, at a simple level, they're like a grouping of tables. So the sys schema is built-in system things that generally came from Microsoft. So if you're looking at an existing query and you notice that it has sys dot in it, that is, I'm trying to think of an exception and I can't really think of an exception, that is almost certainly reading from a built-in object. There can be other schemas that you use. Like you could have, and you can make these as meaningful as you want or as not meaningful as you want. There's a very commonly used schema named DBO, but you could create a schema. You can create a schema named people. You can create a schema named dogs. You can create all sorts of things, and then you can put objects in there. The Go is also an interesting thing. Go is a batch separator. And what it's doing is it's indicating groups of code. Note that I don't have a Go right here after select star from sys.tables. That means, let's see where, I don't think, yeah, I have a Go here after my use statement that terminates that batch. If I was to run all of this code, it would run in a single batch. Now that's not always that, what I can, I can control this just by highlighting a certain bit and executing that. If I highlight a bit of code and I hit run, it doesn't really matter that I didn't use a Go. I told it only run this in one batch. But if I have a bunch of different statements and I want to logically separate them and say these are part of different batches, then that's what the Go statement does. It helps my development environment, either SQL Server Management Studio, or in this case, Azure Data Studio, understand the syntax of what groups of commands do I want to run together. Now, this isn't super meaningful to you at this point. You'll see that when we get to certain later parts of this, when we get to things like common table expressions, there are kind of rules about statement termination and batching can influencing that. So you'll understand why this is more meaningful later. the main thing to know right now is that Go isn't something to be too afraid of or to be too concerned by. It's actually not part of T-SQL. Like, if you think about what it is, it's not a part of the T-SQL language. It is simply something that tools like Management Studio or Azure Data Studio let you do in order for it to decide, okay, how are your queries grouped? So if you were to look up, say, documentation on, the ANSI standard for SQL, you wouldn't find Go in there. I don't really recommend that you look for that unless you're looking for bedtime reading, in which case you could look. I'm sure I'll get an angry email about how fascinating the ANSI standard documents are. Also, we've got a semicolon here. A semicolon is a polite way to end queries. Here we are getting into that American National Standards Institute. They say that for individual, this is a statement, right? Go is our batch terminator. A batch can have one or more statements. I suppose a batch could have 0 statements in it as well, right? You could have an empty batch. I could certainly do this and have an empty batch. Here I have a batch with no statements. It's not really very meaningful, but I can do it. But this is a statement, and the statement is terminated with a semicolon. I don't have to terminate the statement with a semicolon. If I get rid of the semicolon and run this runs successfully. That semicolon is optional in many cases. There are some situations where if you haven't terminated a query and then you start another query, it'll get a little mad if it's in the same batch. And as I said, we'll come up with those later. The details really are that the semicolon as a polite terminator, it's a great idea. It was added to SQL Server, it wasn't added at the beginning. So it was added as later on. So it's often very optional. It doesn't force you to use it. It is a good habit to use it. It is polite. It's a bit like saying please and thank you in many situations. So if I have this with the semicolon and I run it, I get the exact same results I would get if I did not have the semicolon at the end of my select statement. If I run it and also highlight the Go command, I get the exact same results. Here's a little quiz for all of you playing along. If you can remember what I said about the situations where SQL Server is really finicky about this. If you can't remember, don't worry, we'll cover it in a later topic. Now, a big note about select star. I have just shown you, in my first example of a query in SQL Server, I have just shown you what's known as something you shouldn't do. So select star is an anti-pattern to put into queries, because let's take this for an example. So let's say I have written the query select star from sys.tables. There's a couple ways this could go wrong. If I'm using this in an application or I'm returning the information, even if I'm just pasting the results into an Excel sheet, did everyone really need this level of detail, right? Look at all of these columns. Does my user actually need, is remote data archived enabled? Do they actually need all this stuff? Is it meaningful to them? I may have done a lot more work than I needed to do. When it comes to query performance later, the use of indexes in SQL Server, which for now all you really need to know about them is there's these things called indexes that you can use to help performance. Using the minimum number of columns helps SQL Server make the smartest decision about how to use these indexes to run your queries. So if you just do things like say, oh, I want all the columns, that can be fine for exploring things as you're writing your queries. But when you're using your queries in application or saving off your queries, you generally want to be really specific about the columns that you want. And that is one reason is having only the columns you need helps performance. It helps your user by not confusing them by giving them 10 million columns. But then also, what if I had set this up in a really specific process that was okay, these are you have this many columns. And, I set up some sort of automation or some application and things were looking fine. And then someone added a column, the next version of SQL Server. What if there's, it looks like they add columns here all the time. What if they add a new column and I'm just blindly pulling them all? Well, that might break whatever application or process I've set up, right? So select start, you will see me use it. You'll see lots of people use it. It's often something that we use just when we are exploring data. And then we want to say, okay, we only want certain columns in this data. So what I'm doing here is, I'm connected to this instance over here. You can also do this in Management Studio. And I've got multiple databases on this instance. We are in Wide World Importers. So what I'm going to do is take a look at a set of tables. So here we are. We need system tables. And I just realized I know how to do this in Management Studio. I've done this tons of time in Management Studio, but I'm like, have I ever actually browsed this in the system tables in Azure Data Studio? Isn't it fun to do things live? It really is. So notice that we've got all these schemas here. As I scroll through the tables, oh, and this is a view, actually. Anyway, but just had three thoughts at once. We'll get to them in order. Notice that under tables here, we have all sorts of application.cities. That is a schema named application, a table named cities. We have a schema named purchasing that has different objects in it as well. Right? So under views, I'm going to go into views here, and I actually do want, now I'm like, where? So this is all the user objects in Wide World Importers. Let's look in Management Studio. Now I actually, since we're looking at a system one, I wonder where it actually shows them. I may have to do a little follow-up for this class and actually figure out where that shows in Azure Data Studio. So we're going to look at it in Management Studio. And this is just, let's go ahead and connect to my default instance in Management Studio. And in Wide World Importers here, in views, see how it has the little bucket named System Views, right? Like System Views is there's lots of things in System Views. And here we have, if we scroll enough, we can find sys.tables. There we go. Here is sys.tables. So I'm just scrolling down in here to the point we are in the lesson. We can drag table and object names over from Object Explorer. So in Management Studio, I've just grabbed sys.tables. I can drag it over there. If I could also type it, obviously, but if I'm lazy and don't feel like typing, I can do that. I can also go and grab the columns folder and drag that over there, and it lists out all of those columns there. So let's just uncomment this so we can meaningfully edit it, right? This just had it type all the column names for me, so I can do things like say, what specific columns do I want in there, right? I could delete some. It would just save me on a bunch of typing. Looking back at Azure Data Studio, yeah, it just, under this, it just doesn't have that same option to see the system objects. It just shows me the user objects. And I mean, if I look in security, I see the same. I'm actually not sure why it does it that way. So maybe there's some secret to seeing these in Azure Data Studio that I don't know about. We'll figure it out. If we aren't using a system one, we don't have the same drag functionality either, right? So not all of the functionality we have in Management Studio is there in this as well. One nice thing though about Azure Data Studio, if I do sys here, notice that it does have more auto completion built in than Management Studio does. So here, sys.tables, I can now do name, right? If I do NA, it's like, oh, there's a name column. If I type is, it's suggesting to me different columns in there. The big picture takeaway from this is different development environments have different pros and cons, and tricks that you use in one will not necessarily work the exact same way in the other, but they do actually have different benefits. A thing that often a lot of us do on development databases is we say, okay, we want to do select start. If it's a large table, you may have to add a couple extra words in here to not get a 10 million rows. We'll talk about those. in Wide World Importers, it's pretty safe. Wide World Importers isn't a huge database, so running select star isn't gonna return 50 million rows against anything. Then we can see, oh, okay, here's my column names. Maybe I want name, maybe I want type description, maybe I want create date. And what I'm doing is typing the first letter type, getting to the one I want, right? There's TYP, and then you can hit tab to autocomplete. Although in that case, I just want, yeah, you need to make sure it's highlighting the one you want to autocomplete there. And since type was a reserved keyword, it automatically put brackets around it. Brackets let you do certain things. So notice that it didn't automatically put brackets around these other columns. Let me just get my little servers tab back over there. If I want to use keywords like type and not get weird highlighting, or if I want to use, if I have like spaces in things or special characters in things, the brackets will allow you to deal with that. One horrible, stupid pet trick is, and don't do this in production, is that you can do things like create database. Notice that I just named my database a space. And then I did Control E. I have that habitual shortcut thing. I basically did the run button. And notice that this was successful. And now look in my list of databases I could use. I have a database with an empty name. Well, how would I use that database? Typing use and then space, it's not going to know what to do. It's just going to say incorrect syntax. And again, don't do this. Don't do this in production. To use this database, I would have to use those special brackets to say there is something meaningful inside of this. So use the force wisely. So how do we get rid of that creepy database with the empty name? We are going to go say use master now. We're going to go use the master database, a built-in system database, and then we are going to drop database, maybe with 1P, drop database empty name. Now, weirdly named blank database is gone. But that is the power of the brackets in SQL Server. They let you, for better or for worse, use special keywords. But they also can let you use things like that. Let's see, if I use the type column and I notice that I didn't put the brackets around it, see how it's highlighted blue? That's because it's a special keyword. Now my query still works, but someone looking at this might be like, why is type weird? Did you really mean to do that? I could do this to say, yeah, I really did mean to do that. See how it's not got the special highlighting on it anymore, right? So it works either way, but that's part of why you'll see the brackets places. Some people love brackets. Some people hate brackets. If you are working in a team environment with other people, you really want to know what the naming convention is. No one likes anyone who names a database space. So here's another example of how this same code looks. Let's actually make them, I'll get rid of the type column now. So this is the same code. The first snippet here just has the brackets. The second doesn't have the brackets, and see how it looks quite different. We can also use aliases, and we can use brackets and aliases. There are a couple different types of aliases, and here I have actually, and again, this is probably not the best thing for production code, but just showing you that you can do it, I have actually used an emoji in my alias. I am reading here from sys.tables, and I am in the master database. Let's go back into that. So notice that sys.tables is now only returning 5 rows. That's because I went into the master database to drop, I went off script and I created that goofy database named blank. I went into the master database to do it. So now I'm going to go back into Wide World Importers and run this again. Notice now we want 1, 2, 3, 4 columns from sys.tables. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 columns from sys.tables. And for the name column, I have said I've used as to say I want to select the name column and alias it as, and then I put in an emoji, a space, and then table space name, and that appears in the title here. If you are writing a query and you need to bring this into another application, right? Let's say you need to paste the results with headers into something and it needs to look an exact way with spaces in it. You may want to use aliases to get the exact text you want in the result. Generally, if you're writing an application that's querying the database, you don't want spaces anywhere, right? This is usually, like if you're writing an application, spaces are just going to make your life harder. But, there are certain use cases for this where you actually might want spaces in there, and that is how you do it. You can get all sorts of characters in there. Sometimes I also want to use an alias just because name is not very meaningful. Maybe I don't want the emoji. Maybe a more meaningful way to do this would be, as table_name, right? That is another way to alias using as. I don't have to have the brackets there, but I did make name more descriptive. That can absolutely, making your column names as descriptive as possible can absolutely be incredibly useful no matter what you're using this for. You just usually don't want to have spaces in it, but if you see funky stuff with brackets, that might be why it is. The word as, oddly enough, and I didn't realize this for a long time because a lot of people do have this practice of doing aliasing right here. The word as is optional. So this code also works, but I don't recommend it. What I've done here is it says select name space table name, comma. Notice that this works as an alias. Name is being returned as table space name here. I'm not getting a column named name and a column named table name. I just didn't, if I don't specify the as and I only have a space between the column I'm getting and the thing after it, there's no comma there, there's no as there, it will interpret that as an alias. So it is what it is assuming is that I want to alias the name column table name because I just put a space there. What if I don't put a space there and they are next to each other? Same thing, right? So if I just accidentally forget a column, I can mess up because it will think if I accidentally forget a comma, I can mess things up and not get the amount of columns back I want because this can be harder to see, right? So if I have it like this, that is harder to see that I accidentally goofed unless, especially if this was in the middle of a query. So you do need to accidentally look out for this and make sure you've actually got all your commas there, right? Because the fact that I put a return in there doesn't make any difference at all. I could put a return in 10 spaces in there. It would still return a column named table name, which is an alias of name. And that is just something that is really easy to mess up on. But wait, it's even weirder. This is the way that I learned to do aliasing. As we've covered, I am an old person, so I actually learned this a long time ago. This is an old way of doing this. It is not ANSI compliant. In other words, the American National Standards Institute does not think this is a great idea. It works in SQL Server, but it's not a great idea. And why would you care about that? Often it is useful to learn to write language in a way that's going to work as much as it can against different versions of SQL Server and against different products. So in other words, using the ANSI standard syntax gives you a better chance of learning to write queries in a way that might work on a Postgres or a MySQL or that. They are different. There are things you'll have to learn about them, but generally the more standards you use, the more portable it'll be, or the fewer things you'll have to change in your coding to work against different products. But you will still see this in code. You may be reading and working on code that uses this, and the really confusing thing here is note that the direction has been reversed. Select table name equals name. So the column name is here on the right. the alias is on the left. When you see an equals as the alias sign, it means the direction has been reversed. So if I run this query, it will work. We have selected the column name. We have aliased it as table name. Super confusing. So you won't don't worry about this one too much with the equals. You won't run into it too often. I would encourage you to not do that. But if that's the way that you learn, it's not the worst thing in the world either, right? Like, I'm not judging you. I learned that way. One thing that is deprecated is using a string as a column alias like this. So this is similar to the previous one, but notice that I didn't use the brackets. Notice that I used single quotation marks. That is logically a different thing. And this pattern is something that Microsoft has documented is, quote, deprecated. What deprecated means is they really would rather you didn't do it because someday they may just take the functionality out. I don't think they're very likely to take this functionality out. I do think they may introduce certain query forms where this wouldn't work, right? There might be certain patterns when new features that come in where they just don't bother to make this work with the new pattern. They're unlikely to break all the existing code that's written this way just because it's been going on for so long, right? Deprecated means we'd really rather you didn't. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to remove the functionality tomorrow. They might remove the functionality. Right? So deprecated is kind of a warning sign. So I would recommend, if you really like doing this style of aliasing, that's fine, but do it this way and not that way if you like that. All right. Why does this query return only 3 columns instead of 4? A little bit of a review question here. Right? This query returns object ID, and object ID, that doesn't look like an identifier, schema ID, and then user table. And that is because we just put a space here. We didn't, even if we didn't have a space there, it would still do the same thing. If we want the column name and the column object ID, we need to make sure to have a comma in there delimiting them, because if we don't have that comma, it will be interpreted as an alias, right? So similarly, if I remove this comma, now I will get 2 columns back, right? It said, oh, you want the schema ID column and you want to alias that type description. We need a comma after every column that we want to return. Undo that in the file there. All right, couple fun little problem questions. And if you want to work through these yourself, just pause the video or whatever you'd like to do. Stop watching the video. Be free. Follow your heart. And try these yourself in the file. So this one, will SQL Server run this query successfully with all commas aliased as the same thing? So, right, what I've said, I've used fairly straightforward syntax here. I've said I want you get a column named foo, and you get a column named foo, and you get a column named foo, and you. And check this out. I have alias syst.tables as t. So far, we've talked about aliases for columns. The words columns and commas is messing me up. But you can also alias tables. I've said sys.tables, consider that named t. All right, so can I have a query in which all of the columns come back with the same name, even though they're different things behind the scenes? Yes, I can. This will work fine. SQL Server does not care if you want your columns to return with all the same names. I can also, what if I want to do the object ID column twice, or 3 times, or 4 times, right? I can do that as well. It's like, oh, you want to display that many times. You are free. You can do that. That is perfectly allowable. Well, what about this? What if I select the name column 4 times, and then I select a different column, the object ID column, but then call that name too? Can I take different columns and reference them as the same thing? Absolutely, I can. This will also run successfully. You can name your columns whatever you want by either using aliases or by using the column's name itself. All right, how about this one? What if I want to select the name column as foo, And then I want to select foo as foo2. And by I want to alias the name column as foo, and then I want to pick up what is in the foo thing and alias that as foo2. Will that work? This will not work, right? Proof. Invalid column named foo. If I had a column in the table, if sys.tables actually had a column named foo, this would be fine. The problem is that no column in the table is named foo. And I cannot just alias something as foo and then, without the use of any subqueries, CTEs, or possible trickery we're going to talk about later, just in a simple query like this in the select list, I cannot just say, oh, I want to name foo here. I want to reference this thing that was aliased there and now call it foo2. I could select name as foo2 for sure. And part of this has to do with the way the query is executed. It isn't just like, okay, first I'm going to get this column and figure it out, and then I'm going to get this column and figure it out, and then I'm going to get this. It doesn't go one by one in the order you have listed. It is using sets of data, and it is going to return them all. So it is going to process all of these things in the select list at a similar time. It can't be like, oh, I'm going to get, column 1 and call it that, and then, oh, you called it that, so I'm going to get that for column 2. That does not work. Does not work. So you can alias things whatever you want, but you can't reference an alias as a data source in a simple select list. All right, here is just an acknowledgement that we can alias in our from. Sys.tables here has been named T. Now, that doesn't really mean much in this query, right? Because I haven't used that T there. But this is done, you might be like, why does it matter to alias a table? Well, it's really helpful to alias a table. So here we have 3 queries to compare. They're all pulling from sys.tables. This one is saying, I want 4, and we want the same 4 columns in each of them. So this one is just using 3-part naming to be really explicit. I want sys.tables.name. I want sys.tables.objectID. The second one is just using the table name to qualify. I haven't aliased the table at all in these. This one's saying, I want tables.name. This is using 2-part naming to identify the columns. This third one has aliased sys.tables as T, and it is using 2-part naming as well, but it is using the alias. I have said, I would like to give sys.tables a handy nickname named T, and therefore I can save a lot of typing. I can do 2-part naming and be really explicit. I want name from my friend T, which is a nickname or alias for sys.tables. And when we get to the point that we're combining multiple tables together, this is going to be really useful, because when we get to the point where we're using joins, we might have multiple tables that have a name column in them. Which name column do you want? Well, I could type out tables, or using an alias saves me on a lot of typing, and it makes the query more compact and easier to read. I do encourage you to use aliases and to use 2-part naming with them. Note that using 3- and 4-part naming, I've shown you another bad thing. Don't worry, I'll show you a lot of bad things in this class. You've got to kind of use understanding of bad things in order to learn how to do things well. 3- and 4-part naming is also deprecated, and here's a link if you want to learn more about that. You really want to use other forms of naming. Most people use aliasing on tables for convenience. All right, here's some fun quizzes. Will this work? This doesn't look so bad, does it? Now there's kind of a clue in the big red underline in Azure Data Studio. Thanks, Azure Data Studio, for giving it away. I have tried to say, right, here is sys.tables as T, and I'm referencing the alias for 3 columns, but then on this one, I just said, oh, I'm going to use 3-part naming with sys.tables.name, and I'm going to try to run this query, and that does not work. You cannot just combine those like that. It says, I don't know what that is, right? Well, okay, what if I did tables.name, right? That's not 3-part, that's 2-part. No. Right? But what if I just didn't specify the T dot, right? I just said name here. It'll let me get away with that. So if I'm going to do two-part naming, I need to be consistent in how I do the two-part naming. I can't alias something and then use the non-aliased name. I can't use your nickname and your actual name. But I can use your nickname and then just not specify at all. And so with this, it's just going to be like, okay, is there any table that we're pulling from? Is there any table in our from or in our join or whatever that, does anyone have a name column? And if it only finds one query that we're reading, or one object that we're reading from that has a name column, it'll be fine. If I have joined multiple tables and they both have name columns, it's going to be like, you got to tell me which one. Good times, right? So this does work. This often happens by accident, where we've used our alias on multiple columns and we added one in and we forgot to do the alias. You generally want to go ahead and like, this is a better practice, is to use the alias on all of them, but it will work if you don't do it. All right, so this is the basics of selecting from, in this case, a view. This is a built-in view that is a logical representation of a table. Your mission, should you choose to complete it, is to try your hand at the homework. Now, going back to the syllabus here. Back to the syllabus that we've got, the handy dandy syllabus here. If you go to jump to section introducing selects and aliasing, here's the file we just went through. The file number 1. File number 2, select and alias homework.sql. If you open that, once again, click on raw, you can copy and paste it. I may have a problem with emojis, right? I am the first person to admit that my use of emojis may be annoying. Sorry about that. I love that they work. It makes me laugh. All right, so I've already got the file open here. And if you get stuck, I've got some links in here for things that might help you. So, because what we will be doing in this is we will be moving ahead a little bit, right? I'll be asking you to do some things that we covered in class, but also that we'll be talking about things like where, like, and order by. And we're going to go over these in the next class. So most of this is going over the things that we already talked in here, but we will, like, even when we get to question 3, return only rows where email has not been entered null. That's jumping ahead a little bit, and that's why I've put the link to the documentation in here. Please don't feel like I'm mean for doing this. I swear that reading the docs.microsoft.com site, this is one of the most useful skills that you'll do go along with this, right? So I wanted to introduce you to the docs site as part of the class, because as your T-SQL advances, you will become very familiar with reading these pages. They will become your buddies. So I want you to get to be friends already, right? But if you have problems with this, hit it up in the Slack query or the Slack session, and we will help get you going. So there's 7, 8, I think I've got 9 questions in the homework. Have fun with it. Do as much as you can. And what we'll do is we'll go over suggested solutions to the homework in the next class, and then we will move on. Thanks for joining me for this first session of T-SQL for beginners. I will see you soon. I am Kendra Little from Redgate. Bye, folks.